Hey, what's up, Liron here. Thank you for joining me in today's video, and today we're going to learn how to paint beautiful, spectacular, and impressive skies in watercolor. It's going to be a combination of a lot of techniques. And the process itself is much simpler and much easier, but there's still the nuances of wet in wet, so a lot of things to pay attention to. Now, I am going to start with the drawing stage. I'm first setting up the horizon line, so it's really close to the bottom of the scene. A common mistake I see is actually placing it way too high. People need to measure more where the ground is, right? And the ground here is about the quarter, the lower quarter of the painting almost. So the sky takes up about 2/3, right? Now I am establishing perspective here. You don't really have to know perspective. This is a relatively simple drawing. If you just be a little careful when measuring and figuring out the distances, you should be good. But basically, this is a simple box on top of which we're going to put a roof. I made it deliberately taller just because it felt like it's going to be better for the composition. If the structure, the house, the cabin, whatever it is a little, reaches a little higher into the sky. Now I'm doing a bit of a measurement here in perspective, something I have taught in different videos of how to figure out the middle, where the point of the roof is basically. And I place it over the basic structure. You can see a bit of the lower part of the roof, which is important to show, right? So in every simple drawing, there is always a bit of complexity here. Don't let that discourage you. Take your time, measure. If you have to, just trace, do whatever you have to. But the main thing I want to show here is the structure. Very few details like the windows and such, and the cast shadow. The reason I can keep the details very simple is, again, what's the focus of this painting? The sky. And thanks to a rich sky that is full of interesting details and beautiful transitions and wet on dry, we can afford for the lower third to be a little emptier. So I'm going just for the main shapes to show the rooftop, the side of the structure, the cast shadow, a bit of that kind of a chimney dormer kind of a thing that I'm drawing right now. That is one of the most fun parts, by the way, of this process, I think. And yeah, as always, link to the reference photo in the description box. You can follow my lead, trace over it, and then paint with me. Notice what I'm doing here, though. Before I put the windows, I'm marking the spots where they begin and end. No matter how much experience you have, these preparations are key. They're really useful in figuring out where to place things, right? So that all of the windows, tops and bottoms align, right? You don't just put them there. You put a line that follows the perspective, and then based on that, I'm going to draw them. So the more I improve in drawing and painting, the more I understand just how much preparation I do need in order to get a result that looks good, right? So it's funny how the more you improve, the more work you have to put in, actually. But just a side note, an interesting side note there. Now, as for the sky, it goes in a bit of a ring pattern, which I really liked. So you will see me once I start establishing that too. I'm following that shape, that rounded shape that you see there of the clouds parting and showing a bit of the sky above it, which I think is really cool. Now, just to talk a bit about the values as preparation for painting, the rooftop, the ground, the wall, I know they seem very light and you may be tempted to leave them white, but I actually opened this up in Photoshop and compared the values, and if you look at the lightest parts of the clouds, they're actually the walls and the roof and the floor are darker than that. So something in here I go putting in that pattern of ring pattern. So even if you think it's quite dark, it's actually not, and it will hurt your impression if you leave them light, right? Now, of course, you can change things. If you want to leave them white, go ahead and do that. You may need to do some modifications for it to work, right? So I'm starting with the top middle of that ring, and I established that blue for the sky using my manganese blue hue, and I'm painting around some clouds there. And the clouds are the lightest part of the painting, as I mentioned, so I'm leaving them paper white. And what I'm gonna do in just a second is start mixing a darker mix for the shadows under the clouds, right? And I'm gonna paint with that dark mix while still leaving a light gap that you also see there in the ring, okay? Now, it's very important to Take a few steps back, breathe deep, and understand that the sky is so fluid, it's always changing. Start small, start by building up your basic shapes, and don't worry too much about, eating it all up in one go, right? I'm starting with the center and slowly and gradually moving out. What I'm after here is a mix that is slightly bluish, but also quite muted, to get some darks within those shadows, again, under the clouds. Now, what I will do is resort to adding some neutral tint just to make sure, and I sprayed some water to give myself more time, but just to darken it a bit in a faster manner, right? So to put in some of those darker parts. Now, right now, we're pretty much doing wet on dry with some wet in wet. I didn't pre-wet anything on paper, right? I'm using my brush to smoothen out some edges. I'll probably also spray some water to get some of the edges to feel a little, you always want that balance with clouds. You can't just have a bunch of hard edges. You need to have a healthy mix of smooth transitions, hard transitions, all of it together. So yeah, I'm painting in the darker sections. Now I am aware, and you need to be aware that you need to work fast at these times, okay? Because once you start expanding the shape, you have a lot of edges to worry about. Plus, we're gonna have to darken this a little more doing wet and wet in just a few more moments, okay? And to do that, it needs to be wet enough. I actually really like this large goat hair brush by Lebenson Brushes. I find that it helps me with these kinds of large but loose washes a lot because of its versatility. You can do so much with it, and it's just great fun to use. Now note the gap I left there. That's gonna play a nice role in just a few seconds, okay? Now as I get to the mountains, you need to start thinking about the ground, right? And the sky. So before we move down to the ground, what's a better thing to do, and I sprayed some water there to help the paint flow through that white highlight I left. What's important is to understand that we will need to do some more wet and wet in the sky, because right now it has the most paper white light value. It has some of the clouds, the mid value, but it lacks some of those darks, okay? So we will need to do that. Now, luckily, it's still wet enough, so I can mix a warm value for those hills. Now, everything I mix here is muted. The warm is not a perfect yellow at all. The blue is not a perfect blue. And that's part of the beauty of this process. Muted colors, easier to mix, and it's actually what it's like in the reference photo, okay? Now remember what I said about the walls and the ground and everything. It's not white. I'm not leaving it paper white. I'm painting over it. The impression I'm after here will require the sky to be lighter than that. Okay, putting in some blue for that distant mountain ridge, but I'm keeping it fairly abstract. I just put a blue somewhere in the vicinity of where where I see that blue mountain, but I'm not going literal here. The more rich details are going to be in the sky, so I need to keep this area simple. Okay, now I connect everything, right? This is all connected, the walls and the ground and everything is pretty much connected. Now what I should have done is darken the ground a little more now, wet and wet, but don't worry, I'm gonna do it later on, okay? Now is my opportunity to do this while keeping things smooth, okay? Now it's been only a few seconds, right? Even though the video cut, the sky is still wet, but it's starting to dry, so what I need is to use very thick paint to negate to prevent myself from creating cauliflowers. So I'm doing this interesting combination where I put, and I have to go real close there to observe how wet the paper is. I'm mixing a thick mix, and then I come back with the spray and I spray over it to make sure that it blends. This comes down to the nuance of controlling wet and wet. It's not an easy thing. It's something I'm still in the process of learning, and I think it's going to take me a bunch of years to really get it. So don't worry if you mess it up, but just know that at some point you have to stop. At some point you cannot add more details, right? When it starts to get really dry, you need to come back with very thick paint, but then also at some point you have to stop, because otherwise you'll get either cauliflowers, no matter, even if you use just very thick paint with a little bit of wetness, you'll still get cauliflowers, or it's not going to move at all and you'll just get a big harsh edge in the middle of the sky, which we don't need. Okay, now I used the hair dryer at this point to I let it dry like 80%, and then the last 20 I used the hair dryer. Now it's time to start setting up some details. So I'm starting with the mountains in the back, keeping it still super duper simplified and abstract. Okay, so I'm just moving from left to right, warm mix, and then I'm going to switch into a cool mix for that mountain ridge on the right side. I want to preserve its coolness, but I'm not even going to make a clear separation between the two. I'm just going to let them touch in the middle, and I'm perfectly fine with that. Okay. Now, I like to sometimes start from the focal point, but this time I'm working my way back to front. We established the skies, and look at the beautiful flow we got on that left side, right? And then we move a little forward to the mountains, and then we'll jump onto the actual structure and the cast shadow and some of the ground in the foreground and all of that. Okay, now remember our strategy. The sky has a lot of details in it, which means not only can we afford to put fewer details in the foreground, we probably should. And it's probably a wise decision to not go overboard there, because then you end up with a painting where all the focal points compete with one another. The sky is super detailed, the building's super detailed, and even though it gives the viewer a lot to look at, it can hurt the balance, and it can feel a little overwhelming. For the viewer, they're like, what's the message here? What am I supposed to focus on? This is all subconscious, of course. They don't verbalize it, because who knows, people just enjoy art usually when they look at it. So I mixed a dark mix for the top part of the shadow under the rooftop. And look at what I'm going to do here. I'm going to put that slightly dark mix, and it's a brown. It's nothing too complex, really. It's a red, yellow to create an orange, and then it's muted with blue. I'm still using mostly my primary colors. And the colors I'm using, by the way, just to mention again, because a lot of people like to know, my main blue here is French ultramarine. I did use a bit of manganese at the start, and then I'm using quinacridone rose for the red, and I'm using Indian yellow for yellow, and that's pretty much it. So notice what I'm doing. I'm continuing this wash directly. I'm allowing these two spots to mix. That shadow on the roof up top, under the roof rather, and then the wall. It's all mixing together. Now, if you look at this wall, this isn't as dark as it should be. It's gonna need some more darkening, but even the lightest details on it are darker. So I'm working essentially in two glazes. This is the first glaze, and then there's gonna be another one later once it dries. But what's the most important thing here? Keep the flow going, right? We want to keep this lower section of the painting simple, so I gotta keep the flow moving. So I mix a little more blue into what I already had, and I'm moving it towards the left and kind of keeping things a little lighter there. Cast shadows are darker closer to the object that casts them. So closer to that structure, it's going to be the darkest, and then it's going to lighten up the more it moves to the left. And I'm continuing the flow, keeping the connection with that shadow under the roof there, in the wall that's facing more towards us. And I'm going to continue this flow to where? Can you guess? Onto the windows. That's right, because they're not only are they connected, they're actually, some of them are obscured by the shadow. But look at what I'm doing here. I'm making use of this opportunity to also leave the necessary highlights. So I kind of messed it up. I'm going to dab it back with my paper towel and then repaint this shape correctly. This is our opportunity to set up the beautiful shapes of the window, the frame, all of that by negatively painting around it. And when you look at the scene, you will see this. Okay, it is quite visible there. So even though I'm taking care to mix, it's still a great opportunity to set up some shapes in the windows. And one could argue that the window panes are darker than what they currently are, and I may decide later, I probably don't, but you can decide later to darken them. But I actually like this because it keeps the simplicity going, and you don't have now two values, one that's for the window panes and then a darker one for the shadows. So again, the big takeaway for me from this process is not only the sky, but also balancing the painting and asking yourself, what does the painting need? Does it need this detail, or is it excessive? Am I going too literal in trying to paint what I see, and I end up losing the overall impression that I wanted for the painting? If that's the case, you gotta stop and take a few steps back and really think, does it serve the higher purpose of this painting and the overall impression I'm after? And if it doesn't, stop. And reassess your course, which is something that's going to happen in just a second. You'll see I kind of lose the plot, and then I refine it. So you'll notice there's this little base of rocks and stones there in the bottom. and it's a bit warm. So I'm starting to mix that warm mix, and I'm painting over it, and I'm going to add a bit of red to it too later on. But then I catch myself kind of, why am I doing this? These rocks are not distinct enough. In fact, if you look at the left part of this little stone, whatever, little fence or, base, the left almost blends with the walls because it's rather light. And now I'm starting to do all this complex, like, okay, let's add a bit of orange to it to show where the rocks are or their pattern. It's silly. I'm not able to properly mimic the pattern. It doesn't look good, and at this stage I'm like, okay, that's enough. I'm going to blend the top edge. I'm going to add a bit of blue to it to neutralize it and kind of get rid of what I put there. It's unnecessary, it's excessive, it doesn't serve the higher purpose of the painting, and we're done with it. So sometimes you will catch yourself doing that, and that's what a lot of people have happened to when they seem to obsess over a spot. One spot that annoys them, they lose the plot. And for most people, what happens is you also lose the flow. I'm skilled enough to not lose the flow as I'm losing the idea, so the technique still works, but I'm just painting the wrong things. But most people will lose the flow too, and that's a bit tragic. So I'd like you to have that in mind, right? Keep it simple if you can. You can always do another iteration of the painting and figure out how you can express something you failed the first time. But if your idea is to show the sky and kind of keep the rest simple, we can definitely do that here, right? So I'm going to put those little details there on the rooftop. There's this beautiful, beautiful window coming out of it and some cast shadows. Again, keeping it simple. I love these sorts of details. This basically shows us where the roof begins, because right now it's pretty blended with the sky. Especially once we put that cast shadow in, it really puts the entire roof in the right kind of position, makes it clearer where it is. And at this point, the painting is still perfect, in my opinion. Like, everything goes swimmingly. I will make a few changes later that I might regret. Here's a bit of wet and wet, by the way, that I might regret. But overall, like, at this stage, everything is where it should be, right? And the colors aren't matched perfectly, and it's very hard to match the colors perfectly. It's a skill that I'm still improving, but they are pretty close. And even if you go beyond color, the temperatures are pretty close, right? And plus, we got the goal of the painting is done. It's to get those skies, right? To make them look beautiful. The rest is a plus. The rest is a bonus. Now, if you look at the rooftop and the wall, there are some patterns on them. The rooftop, of course, it's the shingles. The wall is the wooden pattern. Now, looking back, I should have probably put more emphasis on the wall and less on the roof. But what's done is done. So I'm establishing some pattern for the shingles, but even while doing this, I'm aware that I'm at risk of putting in excessive details. So I use my finger to smear it around. I'm going to dip my finger in just a second in water, in my water bucket, and I'm just going to move that around. You don't see the water bucket, but it's not as important, actually. I just dab it in there and kind of help the paint move a bit to simplify it. It was too detailed. But for the wall, it was actually important for me to put that pattern. That's actually the first thing I did want to put before the roof even. I don't know why I started with the roof, probably because it's top to bottom, but that pattern is so visible and it helps give the wall the sense of solidness that I just felt like I had to put it in. Now, it's a bit hard to get those lines to be straight when you have to pause with every window. So for some of these, I just cross over the window, kind of, be careful. It's like drawing. You just have to be careful, right? But it does get the job done, I think. It gets the impression I wanted. Now, the ground is too light. As I mentioned earlier, I needed to darken it. So look at what I'm doing here. I'm pre-wetting some sections of it, and then I'm coming back and I'm going to mix a bit of a warm kind of reddish, I already mixed it, a bit of a warm reddish muted gray. And by pre-wetting, some sections are going to blend naturally, while others are going to stay with a bit of a rough edge. But as I do this, I'm like, okay, I don't really need the rough edges, so I'm kind of just going to paint over everything. And if you do a before and after, this was actually quite significant. The ground was too light. And I find that when something's too light, it feels like detached from the painting. And the moment I started darkening it, it just started to feel like an inherent part of it. It really brought it into the painting, and now it feels much, much better. It's very subtle, but it was very important. Now here comes the if it's not broken, don't fix it part. The rooftop here and the sidewall, they look good, right? But I still felt like, man, it needed to be a little darker. So here I am darkening it. Now I am using this opportunity to fix the shape of that shadow of the rooftop that should hang a little lower, which I forgot. I kind of messed that up before. So here we go, fixing it. But I kind of, at the process of it, maybe losing some of the purity of that first wash that I had that kept that painting perfect up to this point. You know, it's a game of really give and take. You don't know if you're making the right decision real time, and it just felt like that wall should have been darker. So I kind of compromised, and even though the first wash felt so beautiful, well, it is actually the second wash, but even though it felt so beautiful, I just felt like I had to do this. So I did. Putting that top window wet on wet with a bit of phthalo blue, which I used for the windows just to get them to be more blue and feel more like window panes. And then I'm painting around some of the doors and window details, but I am going to darken them in just a second. You'll see how I do this. Because I want to keep their tops a little light and some of the middle a little light, right? But what I have to do first is blend the edge of this shape to make sure I don't get a hard edge there. So let's blend it into the shadow and blend the edge, and hopefully we're going to be good. And now to address some of those windows. So I'm putting in a bit of blue where I see some shadows on the left side of the windows and also on the top side in just a second, while maintaining, and the door is fully darker. So I'm going to darken it with a bit of water, let the paint move in. But I also have to leave the top highlight. So I'm leaving a gap there, you see? Just a small gap for the windows. And then a bit of blue inside them, and then a bit of water to help everything move together. It's kind of a wonky, intuitive, kind of weird technique, but it worked well. Now I need to straighten that line to the right of the wall. I'm gonna do that off camera just because I forgot to turn it on for that section, but you'll see the moment I finish this wash, you'll see it kind of being fixed magically, turning into a straight line that actually looks good. You'll see this in just 1 second because I am darkening some of the windows with a bit more phthalo blue. And at this stage, we're really close to finishing the process, actually. We're really, really close. We have about a minute more left because everything is in its place and I don't want to overwork it, as I mentioned. So here I am lifting a bit because it felt too dark, right? That's risky. That's a risky move because you may end up with very uneven washes. So be it, you know, I did my best. Now look at the right side of the wall, especially again, as soon as I cut the video, you see how it's straightened out. And just a few minor details on the top of the chimney, not chimney, whatever it is, a dormer, window, and also on the roof of that window. That's very important because it's going to give it some structure. You'll see I'm adding a bit of the pattern of the shingles just to give it a bit more structure. I'm going to use my finger to smear that a bit and make it not as strong and not as distinct and to not take up too much attention, right? But with that, the process is really, really going to be done. And I'm going to talk a bit about it and give a few pointers and just conclude it for a few seconds. So just wanted to say a few kind of final words about this one because there are quite a few sections that I think turned out very interesting. So just an overall thing, and we'll talk a bit about the process as kind of a conclusion. So the sky here really pulls the painting together. There isn't much going on here, and especially if you look at the background and the mountains, there's literally nothing there. It's just one flat wash. But this is what allows the top part, the top 2/3 is what allows this to stay pretty empty and still feel like, I think, a dynamic painting that has a lot of motion and fun in it. Now, some gems, when you look at the sky, I think this area where I left it empty and then let the paint seep through it and sprayed some water and helped it move down, works really well, and this actually feels like a very well lit spot. Now if you look also at the edges of the shapes, you see these yellowy, kind of yellow versus blue touches. That play of warms and cools is a really, really good way of bringing out that feeling of light. In addition to that, I think this is why this is a really good reference photo, and I mentioned this probably before because it's just so good at having those muted blues and muted yellows, which really help make the process easier, Now, as for this wall, it really is a matter of, if it's not broken, don't fix it. And I kind of am still not sure whether I should have done that additional wash, because it just looked so fresh, right? So it's always that battle between, like, how much do you stick to what you see in front of you, in this case the realistic values that needed to be darker, right, versus if the impression actually works and you don't want to ruin it, right? One final note, this area is where I started being too literal. Then here I tried being a little more literal, but here I really went for it with the stones down below, and I was trying to paint them, and you see, and the color didn't work, none of it worked. And then I zeroed in real fast, and I told myself, okay, this doesn't serve the painting. So even though what you see there is a little more yellow, a little more highlights, what you're doing doesn't serve the painting. You're painting it in a way that tries to imitate it too much, so you're messing up. So I just flattened it out using a bit of blue to mute it down, right? So I hope that is kind of a good conclusion. Let's remove the tape. And as always, if you want to learn how to paint like this, how to let go, enjoy the painting process, be sure to check out the frustration-free watercolor. Link is in the description box below. The kind of complimentary course I'm going to finish soon, the watercolor realism course, is going to be out. And the frustration-free watercolor course really solves the problem of being too tight. And it enables you to hopefully create something like this, where you let go of what you see. You don't try to imitate it, but rather you let the process lead you and have fun and paint something that could be looser, could be more realistic, depending on you, but the approach itself of letting go and stopping with the rigidness, right? That is really key in watercolor, I find. So if you want to learn that, be sure to check it out. Also, a drawing course in the description box below. If you can, drop a like, leave a comment, let me know your thoughts. It always helps and encourages me to do more of these. Thank you so much, and I will talk to you again in the next video real soon.